So Alnoor, welcome. It's really great to have you with us. I've been so inspired by your work over the years through the rules and the many inspiring articles you've written. And I'd love you just to introduce yourself and your work and your approach to activism to our audience.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having me, Ruby. I worked with the Rules Collective for about 8 years. It was a time-bound project. And a lot of the sort of philosophy and approach of the rules is part of my core thinking. And the few of us who came together to sort of create that entity, I guess we were all sort of informed by each other. And so the idea of like my thinking or whatever really doesn't exist. You know, it's like, the shifting relationships create the shifting ontology, really. So the approach of the rules for many years, it existed from 2012 to 2019 formally, and a bit longer before that. Really, there's three pillars to the thinking, which is everything we do is going to address and connect the structural issues. So it's very much a structural constellational worldview, the idea that all oppression is connected. There's no individual issue silo. You can't talk about land rights or climate change or ecological breakdown or economic inequality outside of the economic operating system, i.e. the neoliberal capitalist economic system, which is not just an economic system. It's an ideological system. It's a political system. It's a religious dogma. You know, it's all of these things. And so that was really the first pillar, is seeing constellationally and seeing structurally before approaching the work. The second has been really working directly with social movements, peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements, landless people's movements. We see social movements as the white blood cells of humanity, and that they are also interconnected. What mainstream media wants to do is make it seem like all of these things are sort of disparate, one-off, contextual reactions. But the way we've come to see the world is that whether it's the Zapatistas or the Indignados or Occupy or Extinction Rebellion or the Umbrella movement in Hong Kong or the pro-democracy movements of Russia and India, or the indigenous movements of the Amazon, they all are coming from the same impulse, which is to say that this current system does not work for the majority of humanity or the majority of life. And what we want is a new type of system that is based on the values of solidarity, justice, empathy, generosity, interdependence, nonviolence, and the list goes on. But it's sort of united by values, let's say, and that's really been the second pillar of the work. And the third is the new tools of organizing, really bringing in cognitive linguistics and memetics work in addition to these other aspects. And so the narrative becomes core to the type of work we're trying to do, and not narrative just in a storytelling way, but in like the deep structures that also exist in the mind. So it's like structures at a global level, structures at a horizontal level, and then structures at an inner level of how we internalize stories.
Thank you so much. I love what you are saying there about seeing constellationally, seeing all of the interconnections across kind of the global struggle, but also then working on values, because when trying to unite people from so many different global contexts and being so aware of all of our different global contexts, sometimes different things will suit and be necessary in different circumstances. So, for example, in like South America, the political context there may call for like a lot of the kind of social movements will be calling for systems rooted in kind of more socialist or communist structures, for example, in the peasant Via Campesina movements. Whereas in Eastern Europe, the similar systems had quite a detrimental impact on the peasant way of life back in the Eastern Bloc, or the kind of the mid 1950s and onwards. So it's like, how can two very different political contexts come together with the same vision and have the same common thread? And that idea of being united by values, I think, is a really empowering message, and especially such values of like solidarity and justice and empathy. And it's like, how can we celebrate difference and diversity but have that kind of common vision? Is a really powerful thought. So with EcoResolution, through the months we've been going on a journey exploring many different topics. And this month we're looking at globalization and localization. And it's kind of the month, one of the most important months. And whilst we've been looking at many other themes such as food and farming, waste and consumerism, time and again, we've been looking at how the main reason for this situation is this kind of globalized structure, like the mass globalization, the growth economy. And I'd love just, if you were able to explain what globalization is. If somebody had no idea what globalization is, like we use these terms all the time, but how would you describe it?
Yeah, so we're told that somehow globalization is inherently good, right? And this is part of the ideology of the West, is that progress is an arrow pointing upwards. And part of that arrow of progress is everyone is getting richer and the world is getting better and we're getting more interconnected. But that's actually not true. That's not actually what's happening. What's happening is wealth is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Our ecology is being destroyed. 200 species a day are going extinct. And it's all a direct result of globalization. And I think it's important to just make these distinctions that globalization is not cosmopolitanism. It's not more international cooperation. It is globalized capitalism. That's what most people mean when they talk about globalization. And what globalization is an unresilient economy, as we're seeing during COVID. So it means that what capital does is it finds the places where labor is the cheapest to exploit, where the environmental standards or labor standards are the lowest, and then it moves capital there. And then what it does is there's a whole sort of parastatal layer, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, et cetera, and their role essentially is to clear the deck so more capital can flow easily. And this idea of sort of free market fundamentalism, which is really at the core of globalization. So they'll talk a lot about the free flow of goods and services. But really what's happening is globalization is characterized by three things. It's characterized by the free flow of capital, but not the free flow of human beings. So we have more borders and more immigration processes, and it's more restrictive on the human being, but it's less restrictive on capital. So capital can go to all these places that they can exploit labor, lower standards, etc. So that's the first aspect. Capital moves, but human beings can't. The second aspect of globalization is it requires perpetual economic growth. So we have to grow the global economy at about 3% a year in order for that money to be able to be paid back, right? This is kind of the economics 101 of it. Your growth has to exceed your interest rate in order for that debt-based capital to be serviced. And so what that means is you're doubling the global economy every 20 years. So 3% per year doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at the math of it, it's insane. The calculus of it is insane. And the third, globalization requires, is it requires the sort of and I alluded to this before, this sort of overlay, this sort of parastatal overlay that essentially doesn't value anything that is not increasing the capital of, in the end, very few corporations and very few human beings. And so it'll remove obstacles, trade rules. This is where the whole idea of sort of like free trade agreements like NAFTA in North America and all the sort of new global trade deals that are being sort of pushed. This is really their role. It's to concentrate power even more in the hands of a few corporations. But what they do is they use these like great sounding euphemisms like globalization, because who doesn't want to be global? Who doesn't want to be cosmopolitan? But it's not about globalization of culture. It's the opposite. It's really monoculture. That's what globalization is. It's monoculture of the mind. So if you took this existing system to its logical outcome, we would all be wearing Nike shoes and having Apple computers, using Microsoft software, listening to, Beyonce, or whatever the sort of, corporate capitalism wants you to listen to. And there'd be very little diversity in that ecosystem. And that's what they mean by globalization. And then to say, like, what's the opposite of globalization? Well, it's localization, which is not the same as provincialism. It's not the same as xenophobia. It's being of place, and it's polyculture. So the antidote to monoculture is polyculture. Many ways of being, many ways of knowing, many tongues, many cultures. And there's still interdependence between these things. There's still a global interdependence, but there isn't a monolithic globalization that's extracting value from one part of the world to bring it to the wealthier, global north, the west, however you want to characterize it.
Also, when you talk a lot about this kind of centralization of power, like creating of monolithic structures, monoculture, it's like everything is a mono. And in contrast, there's localization. But what about decentralization? How does localization and decentralization relate to each other? Are they the same thing? Because I could presume we want to move in the direction of decentralization.
Yeah, so I see localization as the sort of umbrella within where all of these things sort of fit. So decentralization is a requirement of localization. Resilient systems is a requirement of localization. Intimacy with place is a requirement of localization. And there's not necessarily a hierarchy. They feed off each other, but this is the thing with language. It's a tricky thing, right? It's like, where are you putting your sort of value and energy? I like localization as a frame, but there's also something about localization that makes people feel it's not connected to a global whole when it actually is. And so we can call it decentralization, and then the focus of that decentralization is to create strong local communities and economies. And when we do that, we have resilient systems. We have a relationship with our local ecosystem. We're growing food and eating food that makes sense to the climate and geography and context and landscape that we're in.
Yeah, I like to think of it as that like redistribution of knowledge, of wealth, of power, and I agree that what's great about the term localization is that it embodies what it wants to create as well. It's kind of almost, there's a type of word that describes when something embodies exactly what it is. So it's a great term. And all of the different effects of localization, particularly when it comes to human quality of life as well, human culture, human community, and the strength and the resilience that creates. It's no wonder that globalized capitalism thrives. The more that it creates separation, the stronger it will get, and the more it wants to deny community cohesion and resilience, because the more that we live in isolated cubicles in nuclear families, existing through Amazon shopping and buying, the more we're going to rely on that system, and the harder it will become to break. And I think for many people, though, already it seems like it seems like we can't go back. Like localization seems like a romantic dream almost, like it's something from the past, the kind of bucolic ideal, impossible. And in some ways, it might seem incompatible with city or urban lives, but not if it comes down to kind of like neighborhoods and like how can we create really strong, resilient neighborhoods within cities. Like in London, for example, there's a lot of local communities which have started creating kind of their own little currencies or farmers markets or community groups. Like Transition Towns movement has moved into like Kingston and Brixton and other areas. And the farmers market is one of the most exciting places to be because you've got people from all different social classes coming together to share food and stories. And it's that other economy. It's like not the financial economy, but the human economy. And how can we prioritize that within the system just as much as the money?
Yeah. And it's interesting. Like when we talk about globalized capitalism, it almost feels like there's this behemoth that is, beyond our control, right? And somehow that it's like more efficient, or and it's actually the opposite, right? Globalized capitalism is highly, highly inefficient, which is on almost every measure you look at, right? So it requires huge amounts of subsidies from the state. It requires protectionism for rich countries, exploitation of poor countries, just the sheer amount of fossil fuel extraction, resource mineral extraction, mining extraction that's required to prop up our current way of living. It's like unfathomable. And so we believe it's really hard to transition, but the amount of energy and effort we're putting in to keep this existing system in place is so extreme that the transition is going to be easier. And that whatever that sort of post-capitalist homeostasis, that equilibrium that gets, we will eventually reach at some point, is going to be a much higher quality of life than we're living right now. And capitalism is it's not a conspiracy, right? That the sort of centralized parastatal bodies like the WHO and the UN and the IMF and the World Bank and so forth sort of need to operate the way they're operating right now. What capitalism is it's a set of generative rules. It's an artificial intelligence. It's a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. And all it's doing is responding to the rules that we've programmed into it, right? Compound interest, debt-based money, the necessity for growth. And you could take that same economic operating system and just program different rules. Like you could have a demiurge currency that devalues at 0.25% or whatever, 0.5% a year, so that money shrinks in value, just like every other commodity, like rice and grain and cattle, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of a sudden your money supply has a more biomimetic, natural flow to it, and there's less hoarding, and there's a higher velocity of money and energy exchanged. And so you could sort of degrow the global economy while increasing the quality of life. And that possibility exists, and it exists in urban environments as well. But the thing we have to be mindful of is that the sort of 1990s and early 2000s, the kind of academic propaganda was that cities are somehow really efficient. And it's going to be the century of the city, and we have to, and it's total bullshit. What city living and urban living requires is sort of high energy fossil fuel extraction. And it just depends on what you're measuring. And so I think it can be done in city living, and we just have to actually rethink the way we're living in cities. And that possibility exists. And I think there was Russell Brand was saying, we know where everything's on CCTV, but we don't know where our food comes from, where our waste goes or where our energy comes from, and it's like, as soon as we get into the inquiry of that and start really mapping these systems and understanding the structure, then once you know the problem, you can help solve that problem. And there is a way to do that within city living that we haven't cracked because we've not been aware of the consequences of the way we've been living, essentially. That's being hidden from us.
Mm. So people often talk about the hidden cost or the true cost of things, like the true price of clothing, or the true cost of, and it's often communities and peoples in the global south who are bearing that true cost. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about the relationship between globalization and colonialism, and how the two relate to each other, like historically, but also now in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's worth just maybe even going back and saying, like, what's the history of global capitalism? How do we get to this stage? Because like all neoliberalism is the latest incarnation, the latest brand of capitalism. And so the sort of long and the short of it is that when we left our hunter-gatherer lifestyles, which we lived in for 99% of human history, where we were in small bands living in highly egalitarian societies. And, this is what Marshall Sahlins calls the original affluent society. And there's a lot of work in evolutionary and cultural anthropology that shows this to be true, and archaeology, like bone samples and teeth samples shows that we were roughly having 2,000 calories a day, which is more than, probably what 80 to 90% of humanity is having now, working 10 hours a week in highly cooperative, safe environments within tribe. Now, of course, between tribes, there was conflict, but to say that possibility exists, and that this sort of modern Western capitalist, materialist, rationalist ideology that human beings are somehow selfish and violent, and it's fundamentally untrue. Because what social science is showing us is that we're highly contextual beings. So if we create the right context, anything is possible. So then to your question, like, what is the context we've created? Well, we went from being in trust to the mother and having our daily sustenance come from gathering and being in that sort of deep resonance, to then creating city states where as soon as there's surplus, that surplus is guarded by a militia or a paramilitary, that then governed by a priest class or a sun emperor or whatever. And the sort of ziggurats of Uruk and Babylon sort of demonstrate that hierarchy. There are these pyramids where grain is stored at the bottom, and then there's a protector class, and then there's the priest class, and then there's the sort of the monarchy at the top of that pyramid. And we actually haven't strayed that far from that model. That London and New York are not that different from ancient Babylon in that sense. Our police are essentially guardians of capital and private property. Our laws are built around, common laws are built around the protection of private property. And we have a system that essentially exploits the poor and allows the rich, through this invention of compound interest, to accumulate huge amounts of wealth. And that wealth largely came from the global south, from a historical colonial perspective. And so what happened in a place like England, for example, is that you had the enclosure movement, which essentially, near the end of feudalism, what they realized is that if people are self-sufficient, we won't be able to extract wealth from them. And so after the sort of pushback and the rebellions around feudalism, they just found a new way to create a feudal system, which was to enclose the commons and turn it into private property, and then turn people into wage slaves. And as soon as that sort of hit its peak of payback, essentially, the sort of colonialist extraction adventure of the 1400s to the arguably now, but let's say, the late 1800s happened. And so, for example, like 30% of Britain's wealth came from India, and that's how the streets are paved the way they are, and there's marble buildings up. It was through the pillage of Southeast Asia, the African continent, and for Spain and Portugal, Latin America, and of course all the European countries took their piece of the pie. But so if you extract all the minerals and all the resources, and then you set up a system where the only way you can acquire goods and services is through fiat currency, debt-based currency, that's either the euro or the US dollar, essentially what you've done is you've imposed a system of tyranny and colonialism that just now exists through the modern banking system. And you look at something like even sort of the fossil fuel system. What happened in the 1950s and the 1960s was that UK economists would go to Africa through all of these sort of post-Bretton Woods bodies that came out of the United Nations and say, the only way you're going to be part of the sort of progress of the future is to have road-based suburban industrial capitalism. And they sort of pushed modern automobiles, and Ford factories came, etc. And then the 1972 OPEC oil crisis hits. And to this day, about 30% or 40% of the African continent's debt has come from that moment of 1972. And so there's this huge amount of accumulated debt that is just made up. It's come from the imposition of the West on the global South. And then you look at something like tax. So everybody loves to talk about the UK's charity, or the US's charity to the global South, but all of global aid from the north to the south through ODA, overseas development assistance, about 160 to 180 billion dollars or something like that, just in tax evasion by multinational corporations that are almost exclusively based in Western Europe and US and Canada. The global South is losing like $1.3 trillion a year, like 10 times of all of aid is lost in tax evasion. So Microsoft, Coca-Cola, Nestle, these corporations have never paid tax on the African continent. And the way they do this is through the tax haven system and through transfer pricing. So the average multinational has 5,000 subsidiaries. They'll sell like 1 million staplers at a loss to their UK branch, which would have to pay tax in a country that they have to respect the tax system. And then they'll claim their revenue in a place like the Cayman Islands where they don't have to pay tax. And so their average tax rate, their effective tax rate, ends up becoming like 5% or something crazy like that. So nobody can compete with them. And so this is a form of colonialism. So like colonialism has never ended. Really, slavery has never ended. Feudalism has never ended. The power elite just find more and more inventive and clever ways to exploit the majority. And now what's so messy about modernity is in some ways they have our complicit willingness to do it, because we want the latest clothes from H&M, and we want the music they tell us that we should be listening to, and the automobiles they design. And so it's actually like the complex of desire that is actually perpetuated by the advertising industrial complex, and the values and sort of shaming complex that then put us into the system, because now people are happy to work for minimum wage in their bullshit jobs. And so the sort of complexity of colonialism has now been internalized in all of our minds. And, I think it was Steve Biko who said, the most useful tool to the colonizer is the mind of the colonized. And in some sense, we're all that.
Yeah, it's so, when you say the history like that and then talk about how it's become so invisible and how we're all so implicated within this system of oppression, and it's extremely overwhelming and heartbreaking, and it feels like impossible to, like, how do you engage with something like that? How do you engage with something that's so enormous but with so many tentacles that it's just like seeps its way out of your grasp? And it's like the only, like, a lot of people may say they're just going to give up and create a community somewhere else, and not engage at all with this system. Whereas other people might say by doing that you just let it continue, then you don't have any impact whatsoever. So, like, that balance of not partaking but still acting in the world and kind of fighting against the system, it's kind of a hard one to do. And, like, how can we turn because like individual action is very tokenistic and small. It has no impact. But when that individual action is taken to community level, that's when it starts to have impact. And particularly then, like, cross-global communities, like, how can we use technology to strengthen these global communities to have a voice that goes around the world? But still, it's so small and so grassroots in compared to this, like, massive system. Yeah.
Well, I'd say maybe three things. One is, in some ways it's overwhelming, and in other ways it's actually deeply inspiring. If we look at the sort of spiritual implications of having incarnated in the Kali Yuga, in the Dark Ages, in the Anthropocene, at the height of corporate power, at the sort of end of late-stage capitalism, where there's nowhere else for capitalism to grow. Well, there is, and it's getting more extreme and desperate, fracking and exploitation of whatever sort of untouched part of the planet there is. But it's sort of running out of space, and even the next doubling. Like, could we imagine a doubling of the global economy in the next 20 years? Like, double the amount of MacBooks and Toyota Priuses and, Big Macs. And it's just, like, physically impossible. Like, we're, like, hitting the limits, right? Like, we've already crossed 4 of the 7 planetary boundaries, according to the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And so I think this is actually a beautiful moment of, I wouldn't say necessarily hope, but of deep possibility. And so like, I'd say that about this moment. And I'd say, but it also requires us to be really good students of our culture. It requires us to spend the time to understand how the neoliberal economic operating system works, what its ideology is, what we've been sort of told about human nature, our role within the cosmos, all of these first principles. So that's really the second part of it. Is this is really a moment for deep inquiry and deep contemplation and a deprogramming and a rewiring of our own internal system. And that sort of self-work also, it does require the small changes, because the reason to do them is not because we think they're going to change the system itself. The reason to do them, whatever that is, traveling less, eating local, eating organic, growing your own vegetable garden, etc., is not because you think that's going to change the system necessarily, but because karmically it's our duty to do that work. To be consistent between our values that's the first point, is really to be in that contemplation of what our values are and how we want to live and how this system works, and, doing that work as students of our culture. And then the second part is, like, living that and being in that spiritual political practice ourselves. And then the third is to also do this at, like, a community level, because the new system is not it's a lot of people in this space talk about the new story as if the new story is just going to emerge. And it's important to understand the old story and to have a critique of the old story, but the new story is going to emerge by the very act of us doing it. And that often happens in community. And so whether that's at an urban neighborhood level or that's, as a group, as soon as you're in that kind of a community environment, then you can keep yourselves accountable. And there can be dialogue around, it's very difficult to be a conscientious objector of capitalism because we're all so enmeshed and so embedded in the system. But when you're in community, that shared inquiry and that shared practice actually becomes easier and more fluid. And there's other people you can do it with. And then there is the fourth aspect of this, which is the superstructural level, so if we're doing this kind of spectrum and you say, the first part of the spectrum is doing that work as being good students of your culture, really understanding how the oxygen works, how the operating system works. And this is not linear, this is a discursive cyclical process and it's constantly happening. But you're sort of doing that contemplation, that inquiry, and then you're applying that at an individual level, whether that's through vegetarianism, whether that's quitting your job as a banker or an advertising exec or whatever. And then it's actually being an application in community level. And creating new structures that don't have hierarchy, that are cooperative, that, all of those things, because that's really, you could do that work individually, but when you do it at a community level, that's kind of when the sort of praxis is born, when that practical application is born. And then there's the superstructure level, which is we still need to change the structure of the system. And yes, it's very important that we opt out and we pull our energy from the existing system. And at the same time, we do need to create and support new systems and new structures that have different value inputs, that have different expressions and articulations of what matters to us at a global level, at a universal level, at a human level. And those opportunities are possible. And they're not necessarily going to happen through electoral politics, but they could happen through creating new economic systems, new currencies, pushing for structural changes like a universal basic income or demiurge currency. Like, we do still have voice in that, even though you may live in a community that's decided to opt out of the capitalist system. So I think all four of those possibilities exist, and they exist simultaneously.
So if now the answer is to create more localized communities, localized structures, localized ways of acting, sort of think global, act local, I suppose, is the slogan that many people use. Would the next outcome be to kind of degrow the economy, to make the economy smaller? And if that is the answer for the countries mostly in the global north, is it also the case for countries in the global south? Is it an answer for everybody? Or like sometimes you hear this idea that global north should stop growing, global south should be allowed to kind of catch up. What is the balance?
Yeah, and it's also related to the question of population, and now on almost every significant measure, the problem is the global north. Historically, the global north accounts for 80% or so of carbon emissions. The average human being in the global north is sort of consuming 4 to 12 times more than the average person in the global south. So there's degrowth is not necessarily growing the economy less. It's like, what are we measuring? If we're measuring this made up bullshit idea of GDP, sure. But I think there's actually radical abundance in degrowing the global economy. And the quality of life we would get, for example, if we move to a 4-hour work week, if everybody received a sort of citizen's income, what would happen is that we would have a creative, spiritual renaissance on the planet, because people would be freed from the toil of bullshit jobs, and they would have the ability then to do the things they really love. And it doesn't mean there wouldn't be additional income from the things you do, but they would just be done for a different reason. And so I do think that we need to support the global South in getting to a place of sort of economic means where the majority are supported. And so I would put restrictions on the global North initially, but they would have to be self-restrictions, right? And what that would do is it would send a signal that we are taking our historical destruction of the planet seriously, and that there is a way to increase abundance and increase the quality of life while reducing the size of the economic output. Because economic output is not quality of life. It's just a bullshit thing we've decided to measure. And this has kind of been the global North's role in the world in many ways, and with all the shadow side of the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment logic. It sort of it takes these sort of half steps that are useful in one direction and completely destructive in a million other ways. And so this is the moment for the West to really innovate, to say that we're going to abandon GDP growth and we're going to abandon economic growth and we're going to really go to quality of life, and we're going to create strong local resilient communities and economies. And if that is the goal of the political and governance systems of the North, that would be the greatest contribution we can make in the next 100 years to the global field.
Yeah. One of the key themes that's come up through the conversation has been a lot about understanding the system that we're a part of, like actually researching and like what is the true cost? How does our economy work? Like it's all of these things that often you're not taught, we don't understand, and then we can't have aware or conscious knowledge of the impact of our actions. So we can't make informed decisions as to like how we act. So someone was watching this, and then they wanted to continue like researching and continue reading to try and get their head around some of the stuff that you've been talking about. Would you have like 3 other people that they might want to look up or books they might want to read?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recommend Jason Hickel. Dr. Jason Hickel, he was a professor at the LSE. He's an economic anthropologist, writes in a really accessible way. We've worked with him for years through the rules. He's got an amazing book on global economic inequality called The Divide, and it's about much more than that. It's really about the global economic system in general. He's got a new book coming out on degrowth called Less is More. I think it should be out by the end of the year or something like that. So I would definitely look at his work. I think the work of Helena Norberg Hodge and Local Futures is really worth looking at. They're kind of I think Helena is probably the most articulate person on localism, and they have great resources on their site. They do a conference called Happiness of Economics, and they put a lot of those talks up, if not most of them up. And then I would look at Vandana Shiva. And yeah, you could just check out what she's doing online. She's written probably, 12 plus books. All of her books are really amazing. But her lectures are great. And she's really engaging public speaker around these issues. And I'm trying to think, who else, what groups. But yeah, as it comes to me, I can also send a note to you and we can put up some resources. But yeah, those 3 are a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love all of those 3 so much. Jason's book, The Divide, was really transformational as to my understanding of how the economic system worked globally and development as well, which I wasn't aware of until I read Jason's work. Yeah, so thank you so much, Alnoor. It was so great to chat and appreciate your time so much.
Yeah, you too, Ruby. Thanks so much, and thanks to James, who's been helping out on the back end. So lots of love.
Yeah.